What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Kelsey's Constrictors. In today's video, we are going to be talking about ball pythons and how to set up their first enclosure, everything that you need starting out, and what type of enclosure that you can keep them in. I can't believe it's Christmas already. This year has absolutely flown by. I also wanted to say that this is the new office space. I have the couch behind me, so I'll probably be doing some videos on the couch, be doing some videos at my desk, and then I still have my setup in the snake room, obviously, so that'll give me a little bit of variety so it doesn't look exactly the same every single time I'm filming. Today I am featuring Lucky. She is a bamboo het ultramel from Ember's Ball Pythons. They have an awesome collection and an awesome snake room. If you haven't seen it, go ahead and follow them on Instagram, check out their YouTube, and that is where I got her from. She is super duper sweet, very healthy, and she has grown a ton. I can't believe it's been a year since I got her. I love the holidays. I love everything that comes along with it, like decorating and presents, but it is an extremely stressful time for me. Every year feels like I'm just running around like a chicken with my head cut off, so I'm ready for it to be over. And also my birthday is coming up, so once my birthday is over, then things hopefully will calm down. I feel like I say that in every video, but I'm looking forward to the new year. I know next year is going to be awesome. I've got some really awesome plans coming up for next year, and I also still have my eggs in the incubator. They are actually due to hatch on my birthday. The first week of January, we will be doing an egg cutting video on that, so super duper excited. I did have 8 good eggs. Unfortunately, a few of them did end up going moldy. So if anyone has experience breeding ball pythons and has kind of gone through the ringer a few times, the problem that I was having was with the press and seal that I had on the bin was becoming it had way too much condensation on it. And so what was happening was the water was actually dripping directly onto the eggs. No matter what I did, I tried to place the straws kind of at incline so that they'd be taller on one side where it would kind of drip down the side of the tub, but that didn't work. So I've basically just been having to check on them every single day, pull them out, make sure that there's not too much condensation on there. And the routine I've come up with that has worked best for me is I have changed the press and seal every 2 days. That's the only way I have found to keep the condensation from actually getting onto the eggs. So it's kind of frustrating because it takes time out of my day. It's not much time out of my day, but it's annoying to me that I have to go in there and check on them every couple of days instead of just being able to kind of set it and forget it and check on them every week or so. So that was kind of like a roadblock that I hit that's been kind of annoying. But so far I still have 4 good eggs, and since I've been changing it every 2 days, I haven't had any more problems. So we have 4 eggs that will be hatching the first week of January. Super excited, and fingers crossed for a female banana. So be on the lookout for that egg cutting video. It's going to be super exciting, my first one. And then I do have a couple of females that I have been pairing. So far, no eggs yet, but we're still pretty early in the season. So looking forward to what those girls will bring me next year. And I just know 2023 is going to be awesome. This is kind of, I guess, my end of 2022 video. It wasn't a super exciting year in terms of my breeding season just because of everything that happened last year. But overall, this has been an excellent year. And a lot has happened, as I'm sure y'all know if you've been watching my channel. Between moving and finally getting my snakes back from my friend's house and everything, it's been a very stressful, action-packed year for sure, but I know next year is going to be even better than this year, especially because things are getting a little more stable now. Alright guys, so we will just jump right into the video. So we're going to be talking about ball pythons today and how to set up an enclosure, kind of like a ball pythons 101 type thing. I'm going to cover enclosures, I'm going to cover feeding, handling, the things that you need for their first enclosure, things like that. I'm just going to cover the basics of ball pythons and how to keep them. Most importantly, before you bring your snake home, you want to make sure that the enclosure is already set up for them. You don't want to bring them home and then have them sitting in their bag or whatever box that you brought them home in, or pick them up from FedEx from, whatever the case is. You don't want them sitting in that for hours on end while you try and get everything set up, and then you realize, oh no, I forgot something, now I gotta run to the store store. So make sure that everything's set up before you bring the snake home. That's just going to make the easiest transition for your snake. Moving around, changing enclosures, changing owners, that's very stressful for the snake. So we want it to be the easiest that it can possibly be. So just make sure that you have it set up before you bring it home, and then you can put it directly into the enclosure and then give them a week or two to kind of settle in, get used to it before you handle them. And then the other thing I want to say is that it can seem very daunting when you're first getting started, especially if this is your first snake or your first reptile. Maybe even you've had one before, but it's been a while, maybe you were a kid. It can seem kind of daunting with all of the information out there, the different ways that people keep their snakes, the different ways they set up their enclosure, the different way they handle them, the different ways they feed them, all that kind of stuff. But I promise that it is not as hard as it sounds or as it seems. As you're searching the internet, you may find multiple different ways to do different things. So it's not as hard as it seems. You really just gotta dial in on what's gonna work for you best. My only recommendation in that realm particularly is to kind of stay away from Google, Wikipedia, Facebook, things like that. Just like you don't search for medical advice on WebMD because it'll tell you you have cancer and you're gonna die tomorrow. Searching for reptile information in the wrong places is going to be confusing and probably wrong. So now we'll get into the meat and potatoes. But first, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. I come out with new snake videos every single week. I try to do a lot of educational stuff. I've also recently started a new series doing interviews with people, new breeders, seasoned breeders, some hobbyist keepers, people that just have lots of different pets, that just love reptiles. I interview all kinds of different people just to keep the community connected and help y'all get to know some other people. So that being said, if you're interested in being interviewed and being on my channel, leave a comment below and let me know. If you're not interested, that's totally okay. But if you are watching this video for the educational value and you are about to get a new reptile or a new snake, leave a comment below and let me know what your next reptile is. So the first thing that you obviously need for a snake enclosure is going to be their substrate. There are lots of different ways that you can do substrate for a snake, and also keep in mind, I can't remember if I mentioned this, but this is going to be specifically for ball pythons. So if you keep other kinds of snakes, if you're thinking about other kinds of snakes, a lot of this information does overlap, but if you're not going to be keeping ball pythons, make sure that you do your own research for your own species of snake that you have or that you're going to be getting. So the substrate that you keep your snake on is a very important part of this process. As I said, there are lots of different kinds of substrate that you can put your snake on. The one that I use is Reptitherm. I used to use Eco-Earth, which is also a coconut husk substrate. The reason that I switched from that is because Eco-Earth is very, very fine, and it does tend to not hold humidity as well as the bigger chunks. Reptitherm, Cocoa Block, things like that, those are going to be big square chunks of coconut. They just hold humidity a little bit better. It's also a lot easier to clean. With the Eco-Earth, I found that it was extremely fine. It was a very fine dust. Also, this had to affect my snakes as well because it affected me. When I did go to clean it, the dry pieces would just kind of poof up and just release dust particles everywhere and get in my nose. I was finding myself wearing a mask when I was cleaning it. So switching to the Reptitherm has been a lot better for me personally. That's what I recommend. But you can also keep your snakes on paper towels, newspaper, butcher paper, plain butcher paper. I would recommend not using only newspaper just because when it gets wet, the ink can actually be released from the newspaper and it can get on your snake's skin. A lot of times that ink is toxic. So if you are using regular newspaper, you can put paper towels on top of it to kind of create a buffer zone. That also makes it easier to clean the tubs as well. A lot of first-time owners will buy kind of an all-inclusive kit that comes with the glass tank, it comes with substrate, it comes with a water bowl, it comes with a humidity gauge, a temperature gauge, stuff like that. It'll all come inside of it and you can buy it all as one piece. I tend not to recommend those all-inclusive kind of kits just because a lot of times they have some stuff that you don't need and sometimes they're missing stuff that you do need. You might end up spending a little bit more money and be missing some things or have things that you're not going to use. I tend to stray away from that kind of stuff, but there's nothing wrong with it. Just make sure that you have everything you need when you do buy it. A lot of those all-inclusive kits come with aspen as a bedding. Now there's nothing wrong with using aspen as a bedding for your snakes, but it doesn't hold humidity as well as coconut does. I recommend doing kind of your own research and getting things one by one that you'll actually need and use. Those kind of all-inclusive kits are really good for ball pythons or colubrids especially, or Kenyan sand boas they're good for as well. But again, it really just depends on what you're getting. Make sure you do your research, make sure you got the right thing for your type of snake. For a ball python, I recommend the cocoa husk. That's really the best because it holds humidity really well and it's easy to clean. So heat and humidity is going to be the next thing we'll talk about. Heat and humidity is As you probably know if you've watched any of my videos, the most important thing that I try to harp on with people, because it's one of the main things that people tend to get wrong, especially in the beginning. You need to have a hot side and a cool side for your ball python. As I'm sure you know, reptiles are cold-blooded, which means that they cannot regulate their own body temperature. So having a warm side and a cool side is going to allow them to regulate their body temperature through picking which side that they're going to be on. Your cool side should be around 72 to 75 degrees, and your warm side should be 88 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Depending on what type of enclosure that you are keeping your snake in, which I will touch on in a second, there's a few different ways that you can heat the warm side for your snake. You can use a heat lamp, you can use an under the tank heat mat, you can use heat tape that you kind of rig up yourself. I don't recommend using heat tape for a first time snake owner just because it can be a little complicated. It does require a few more supplies than just buying kind of a sticky heat mat that you can get at the pet store, but it is more cost effective to use heat tape and kind of rig it up yourself. No matter which heating element you choose to go with, you want to make sure that you have a thermostat to plug the heating element into. For under the tank heat mats, I actually did an experiment, and the under the tank heat mats without a thermostat can get up to 125 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're not using a thermostat, the heating element can actually burn the belly of your snake. So whatever you choose, make sure you're using a thermostat. The heat lamp is great because it provides light for them, and it can also heat from the top down. But for ball pythons, especially if you're not keeping them in a glass enclosure, they don't need the light necessarily to live happily or live healthy. Other reptiles like lizards, bearded dragons, things like that, they need the UVA, UVB spectrum, and they need that heat lamp. A lot of them also need like a nighttime infrared that provides UVA, UVB, but for ball pythons, they don't need that to live happily or healthy. So that is a nice little addition that you can add to them. But if you're keeping them in a rack system, which again I'll touch on in a second, you can't have a light obviously with a rack. It's not a necessity for a ball python, but it is a nice thing that you can add, and it does help with the warm side as well, heating that. Obviously you need a water source for your snake. They always need to have fresh water in there. I also recommend getting a bowl or whatever it is you're using. Make sure whatever water source is big enough for them to actually at least get the majority of their body inside of it. When they're going through shed, it can be kind of uncomfortable for them, and if your humidity is not quite right, they can actually have a bad shed. It can be patchy, it can come off in pieces. There's a lot of problems that come with not having the humidity right. If you do have trouble keeping your humidity up, there's a couple different things you can do, which I've touched on in other videos. You can mist their enclosure, you can provide them a humidity hide box, and that will help them get their shed off in one piece. Speaking of hides, you want to make sure that your ball python does have a place to hide. They are ground-dwelling ambush predators in the wild. They need somewhere to hide, to feel secure, to feel safe, and this is especially important if you are using a glass enclosure for your ball python. Since it's open on all sides, they can feel very vulnerable if they don't have somewhere to hide. Another great addition to a ball python enclosure, which is not necessarily a necessity, but it is a great addition, is adding some decoration in there, some logs for them to climb on, some plants. A lot of people now, it's very popular to do bioactive enclosures where you've got live plants in there. It is a lot more difficult to take care of, a lot more to maintain than just a regular enclosure with some fake plants and a couple of logs. So do your research on that. I actually don't know anything about bioactive enclosures, so I'm not going to touch on that. But they do look awesome, and I don't really know what all goes into maintaining them, but it's definitely a lot more maintenance than if you're just using fake plants. As far as feeding your new ball python, there is a few different options. If you are getting a hatchling ball python, most breeders do start them out on either live mice or rat pups. I recommend getting one that's on rat pups because it's easier to continue feeding them rats than it is to switch from mice to rats. A lot of ball pythons can be very picky when it comes to their food, so if you have a ball python that has been started on mice, it's not necessarily impossible to switch them from mice to rats, but it can be difficult and maybe even a daunting task, especially if this is your first snake. Also, if this is your first snake, make sure you know if the snake has been fed frozen thawed rodents or live rodents. If you're not comfortable feeding live, which a lot of people aren't, it's also its own task that you have to be able to supervise in and of itself. So if you're not comfortable feeding live, make sure that you ask the breeder or the pet store where you're getting it from, wherever you're getting it from. I also don't recommend getting reptiles from a big box pet store, but I will touch on that in a later video. But wherever you get your snake from, make sure you understand if the snake has been on frozen thawed or if they've been fed live, because typically if the snake eats live, it can be very, very difficult to switch them to frozen thawed. And a little side note that I'll add in, if your snake does eat live rodents, and this is legitimately something that I have heard from people before, do not get any wild caught rodents. Do not feed wild caught rodents to your snake. I've had people ask me if I do that. I've also heard other people say that they have done that. That is a big, huge no-no. Do not feed wild caught rodents to your snake. They carry pests, they carry parasites, they could bring fleas into your house, they carry all kinds of disease and sickness and all that sort of thing. I understand that the snakes do eat rodents in the wild, but those snakes have been conditioned to survive in those kind of conditions and things like that. These are pet snakes that have been in a very, very controlled environment. So feeding wild rodents to your pet snake, terrible idea, big no-no, definitely don't do that. As far as the frequency of how often you should be feeding your snake, baby ball pythons up to about 3 months old, they usually eat every 5 to 7 days. After that, once a week. Once they get around 800 to 1,000 grams, I either feed them once a week, a small rat, or I will feed them every 2 weeks, depending on if it's a male or a female, depending on how old it is, depending on the weight. I will feed a bigger rodent every 2 weeks. So depending on what your snake eats, if it's on mice, then you probably need to feed it every week. If you're feeding your snake rats, then you can go every 2 weeks. If you have a very large ball python, such as a very large female, maybe 2,500 grams and above, you could probably get away with feeding every 3 to 4 weeks if they're eating jumbo rats. I know there are some female ball pythons that get very, very large. They get 6 feet. So if you have a snake that's that big, you can definitely feed it every 3 to 4 weeks rather than every 2 weeks. But again, it really just depends on the size of the rodent. If you're not sure, because there is a lot of different ways that you can do this, the best way to know if your snake is ready to eat again is to check their cage every day, which you should be doing anyway, and make sure that they have pooped. Once they have pooped out their last meal, then you can give them a day or two and then they should be ready to eat again. If this is your first pet snake, you are probably wondering about handling and temperament. I do have a video on my channel already about choosing a breeder and choosing a healthy snake for the first time, so if you haven't seen that, I'll go ahead and link it above. But as far as temperament of your snake, once you get it home, make sure that you're handling it a couple of times a week at least. If your snake is defensive, if it's hiding, if it's curled up in a ball, if it has its head in an S shape, if it looks like it's going to strike you, if it does strike at you, then just give it some time, give it a couple of days. You can also utilize a snake hook, which I have a video on my channel about that as well. You can utilize a snake hook to kind of help you get the snake out, get it used to being handled, things like that. The younger your snake is when you get it and the more often you handle it, the better the temperament will be as a general rule. The biggest thing that I will say is when you are getting ready to handle your snake, make sure you wash your hands, especially if you've been handling rats. If you breed rats, just make sure you wash your hands and change any clothing. Like for example, I have a lot of pet rats along with my feeder rats, so I hold them, I handle them, I try and socialize them, so they climb all over me. Even if I wash my hands, I still have the scent on my clothes, so make sure you change clothes, make sure you wash your hands, all that good stuff before you go to handle the snake, and that's going to minimize your chance, your risk of getting bitten or struck at. That's going to minimize that risk a lot. And now we will talk about the most important and most debated topic when it comes to housing ball pythons: the enclosure size, the enclosure type. Now, I am a ball python breeder. I do have one glass enclosure. I have a pet boa constrictor. I keep her in the glass enclosure, but all of my ball pythons are in racks. I have a very detailed video on my channel already. I will link that above and in the description below. It's a very detailed video about racks versus glass enclosures, so I'm not going to go into super big detail about that in this video. I will touch on it a little bit. There are people out there who believe that racks are cruel and evil and you should never keep your snake in a rack system. Keeping your snake in a glass enclosure, if you are a hobbyist keeper or you only have pets, whatever the case may be, if you only have a few animals, glass enclosures are great. I recommend them. They are a little bit harder to clean, they take up more space, but there's nothing wrong with them and they're a great option. However, it is simply not a logical option for me. I cannot have 25 glass enclosures in my house. Even though this house is much bigger than my apartment, it's still just not a viable option. So if this is your first pet snake, there is nothing wrong with keeping your snake in a plastic tub, especially if you are saving up for a bigger, nicer glass enclosure, if you want to do more bioactive stuff. There's nothing wrong with keeping your snake in a plastic tub. But again, all of the same things apply. You gotta have heat, you gotta have humidity, you gotta have fresh water, all that good stuff. Probably the most debated point about glass enclosures versus versus racks is how much room the snake actually has to stretch out, move around, whatever the case may be. There are people out there who say the ball pythons should be in a 40-gallon enclosure. Now that, again, like I said, that's great. Your snake it's a wild animal. It should have as much room as possible. However, when you have a lot of snakes, it's just not a convenient option. It's not possible. There's just not enough room, unless you live in a mansion, there's just not enough room to have that many glass enclosures that are 40 gallons or larger. So what size is appropriate for your snake? With these smaller snakes, if you're getting a baby ball python, you do not want that baby ball python in a 40-gallon enclosure unless it is extremely cluttered and has lots of hiding places. Because a baby snake is already very, very defensive. Maybe not necessarily defensive, but they're very on alert because they're babies, they're small. It's instinctual for them to be scared of everything because everything's bigger than them. If you are keeping a baby snake in a large enclosure like that, just make sure that they have lots of places to hide, because if they feel like they're in the open, if they feel like they're vulnerable, they could go off food, they'll be unhappy. So that's probably my biggest thing, is no matter what size tank or tub, whatever it is that you're keeping your snake in, just make sure that they feel comfortable. What I tell people is that as long as the snake has enough room to stretch their body out fully in some way, shape, or form, then the tank or the tub, whatever it is big enough for them. As long as they're not cramped, if they have to stay balled up in a ball or all coiled up in an S or anything like that, if there's not enough room for them to come out of that resting position, then it's not big enough. For a hatchling ball python up to about 6 months, you can keep them in a 10-gallon glass tank. 6 months to a year, you could keep them in a 20-gallon. After that, it really depends on the size of the snake. Depending on what you're feeding your snake, it might grow fast, it might grow slow. If you feed your ball python mice, they tend to grow at a much slower rate, so they're not going to get as big as fast, which of course means that you don't have to upgrade their enclosure as fast as you would if you were feeding them rats. So there are a lot of different variables that go along with what type of enclosure you're going to choose for your snake. Like I said, I have the video that I did specifically on glass enclosures versus a rack system. I'll link it down below. So if you want to check that out, I go into a lot more detail about it and a lot more different controversies that go along with it. So if you want to check that out, I have it linked below. So if you have snakes already, whether it be 1 or 25, what was the most important thing for you when you were first starting out that you maybe didn't know about, maybe that you didn't realize, things that you didn't think were important that ended up being very important? If there's something like that you realized early on, go ahead and comment it below. Make sure you like and subscribe. Like I said, I come out with new videos every single week. I've got some new interview videos coming out. If you're interested in being interviewed, you can send me a message on Instagram. It's Kelsey's Constrictors, or you can comment below and I will reach out to you. Thank y'all so much for watching. I hope you had a very Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year, and I'll see y'all next time. So if you have a ball, some ball pythons can be extraordinary. As far as an under tank, you can use it under tank to have a thermostat plugged into your heat unit. I said that backwards. Not necessarily impossible. Can I help you?